The smell of motor oil always hung in the air around Thomas Wilson. His hands, strong and calloused from years of hard work, moved with the confidence of someone who understood engines better than most people understood their own heartbeats. At 38, Thomas had built a reputation in Pinewood as the mechanic who could fix anything with wheels. His small shop wasn't fancy, but it kept food on the table for his wife Diane and their 3 children. It was a warm Tuesday afternoon in May 1987 when everything changed. Thomas was bent over the engine of Mrs. Parker's old Buick, sweat beading on his forehead as he tightened a belt. His youngest daughter, Lisa, just 5 years old then, was sitting on an upturned milk crate nearby, watching her daddy work with wide-eyed fascination. "Hand me that wrench, baby girl," Thomas said with a smile that always made his eyes crinkle at the corners. Lisa jumped up, proud to be helping, and carefully passed him the tool from his neatly organized workbench. That's when the police cruisers pulled up, tires crunching on the gravel driveway. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts. Thomas straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag, confused but not particularly worried. He'd never been in trouble with the law. "Thomas Wilson," the taller officer called out, his face hardened. "That's me," Thomas replied, stepping forward. "Something wrong, officer?" "Put your hands where I can see them," the officer demanded, his voice suddenly sharp. "You're under arrest for armed robbery." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. "What?" There must be some mistake. "Daddy." Lisa's small voice trembled as she clutched her father's pant leg. "It's okay, baby," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady for his daughter's sake. "Go inside and find your mama. Tell her to come out here." As Lisa ran inside, Thomas tried to reason with the officers. "I've been right here all day. Ask Mrs. Parker. I've been fixing her car since this morning." The second officer grabbed Thomas's wrist, twisting it behind his back. The Quick Mart on Elm Street was robbed at gunpoint 2 hours ago. Witness described a tall black man in a dark jacket. That fits you pretty well, doesn't it? There are hundreds of men who fit that description. Thomas protested as the cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists. "I wasn't anywhere near Elm Street. I've been right here working." Diane came running out of the house, Lisa trailing behind her. Thomas's older children, Anthony and Keisha, appeared in the doorway, watching with horror as their father was pushed against the police car. "What's happening?" Diane cried, her voice rising with panic. "Thomas." "They're saying I robbed a store," Thomas called back, struggling to maintain his composure. "Call Mr. Reynolds. He'll help sort this out." Reynolds was a local attorney who had helped Thomas with paperwork when he opened his shop. "You can't take him," Diane pleaded with the officers. "He's been here all day. Ask anyone." But the officers weren't listening. As they pushed Thomas into the back seat of the cruiser, he locked eyes with his family one last time. "Don't worry," he called out, forcing confidence into his voice. "This is just a mix-up. I'll be home for dinner." As the police car pulled away, Lisa broke free from her mother's grip and ran after it, her small legs pumping as fast as they could. "Daddy," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy, come back." Down at the station, things only got worse. Thomas sat in a small, cold interrogation room for hours, repeating the same thing. He was innocent. He had been at his shop all day. There were witnesses, but the detective seemed uninterested in his alibi, focusing instead on a grainy security camera image that showed only the back of a man's head. "Just confess," the detective said, sliding a paper across the table. "Make it easier on yourself and your family." "I can't confess to something I didn't do," Thomas replied, his voice hoarse but determined. By nightfall, Thomas found himself in a jail cell charged with armed robbery. Through the small window, he could see stars appearing in the darkening sky. His children would be getting ready for bed now, confused and frightened. His hands trembled as he sat on the thin mattress, but not from fear, from anger at the injustice, and from worry for his family. He had no way of knowing then that this was just the beginning, that the same system meant to protect innocent people was about to crush him beneath its weight, guided by the hidden hand of prejudice. And at the center of it all waited Judge Walter Brennan, a man whose stone-faced facade, hid a deep-seated hatred that would soon change the Wilson family forever. The courthouse stood tall and imposing against the morning sky as Diane pulled up in Thomas's old pickup truck. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. 6 weeks had passed since Thomas's arrest, 6 weeks of scraped-together bail money falling short, of visiting hours behind glass barriers, of telling the children that everything would be okay when she wasn't sure of herself. "It's gonna be fine," said Thomas's brother Ray, sitting beside her in the passenger seat. "Truth's got to count for something in there." Diane wished she had his confidence. The lawyer they'd been assigned, a young man named Paul Griffin with bags under his eyes and a briefcase held together with duct tape, had met with Thomas exactly twice before today. "The public defender's office is swamped," he'd explained with an apologetic shrug when Diane confronted him about it. Inside the courtroom, Thomas sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting suit borrowed from his cousin. When he turned and spotted his family filing into the back row, he tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Lisa wanted to run to him, but Diane held her back, whispering that they had to follow the rules here. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Walter Brennan," called the bailiff. The judge who entered didn't look like a monster. With his silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he might have been someone's grandfather. But the cold look he gave Thomas as he shuffled through papers sent a chill down Diane's spine. The trial moved faster than Diane expected. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed woman with a voice like a razor, presented the case as if it were already decided. Thomas Wilson, caught on camera rubbing the Quick-Mart, identified by a witness who was absolutely certain it was him. When that witness took the stand, the store clerk, a nervous young man named Trevor, he pointed at Thomas with less conviction than his statement suggested. "I think that's him," Trevor said, glancing at the prosecutor for approval. "I mean, it was definitely a black man about his height." Paul Griffin finally stood up then. "But you told police you only saw the robber for a few seconds, and he was wearing a hat pulled low, correct?" "Well, yeah, but..." "And isn't it true that the only clear feature you reported was that he was, quote, a tall black guy?" Trevor shifted uncomfortably. "I guess so, yeah." Judge Brennan cleared his throat loudly. "Move along, Mr. Griffin. The witness has made his identification." This happened again and again throughout the day. When Mrs. Parker took the stand to testify that Thomas had been fixing her car all that afternoon, Judge Brennan interrupted her repeatedly, asking if she had checked her watch, if she might have been confused about the time, if Thomas could have left without her noticing. "I was sitting right there drinking iced tea and watching him work," Mrs. Parker insisted, her voice rising with frustration. "He never left my sight." The judge leaned forward. "Please control your tone in my courtroom, ma'am." By the time Ray took the stand to confirm he'd dropped by the shop around the time of the robbery and seen Thomas working, the pattern was clear. The judge cut off testimony supporting Thomas and let damaging statements run long. When Paul Griffin tried to object, Judge Brennan shut him down with warnings about contempt of court. During a brief recess, Thomas huddled with his lawyer in a corner of the courtroom. "Why is he doing this?" he whispered, watching Judge Brennan chat amicably with the prosecutor across the room. "It's like he decided I'm guilty before we even started." Paul looked down at his notes, his face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "Judge Brennan has a reputation," he said quietly. "Black defendants don't tend to do well in his courtroom." "So what, that's it?" Thomas's voice cracked. "I'm going to prison because of who I am, not what I did." "We're not done fighting," Paul insisted, though the defeat was already creeping into his voice. "We still have your testimony." But when Thomas finally took the stand that afternoon, it felt like walking into a trap. Every word he spoke seemed to irritate Judge Brennan more. When Thomas explained his alibi in detail, the judge interrupted. "Mr. Wilson, are you aware that armed robbery carries a sentence of up to 20 years in this state?" Thomas blinked in confusion. "Yes, sir, but I didn't." "And are you aware that lying under oath is perjury, which carries its own sentence?" The threat hung in the air like smoke. In the gallery, Diane pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. Beside her, Anthony, just 12 years old, whispered, "Why is he being so mean to Dad?" Diane had no answer. How could she explain to her children something she herself couldn't understand, that in this room, under this man's power, The color of their father's skin had already determined his fate. As Thomas stepped down from the witness stand, his eyes met Diane's across the courtroom. In that moment, they both knew what was coming. The system they believed in their whole lives, the justice they'd been promised, was nothing but empty words on courthouse walls. The word guilty fell like a hammer in the silent courtroom. Diane let out a small cry before covering her mouth with her trembling hand. Behind her, Thomas's mother collapsed into Ray's arms, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Anthony stared straight ahead, his young face hardened with a rage no child should know, while Keisha held little Lisa tight against her chest, trying to shield her sister from the nightmare unfolding before them. Thomas stood perfectly still, as if moving might shatter him completely. He'd expected this verdict, had seen it coming in the judge's eyes from the first day, but expecting a blow doesn't lessen the pain when it lands. The defendant will remain in custody until sentencing next week, Judge Brennan announced, not bothering to look at Thomas or his devastated family. As the bailiff approached to lead Thomas away, the reality of what was happening finally broke through his shock. "I love you," he called to his family over his shoulder. "Stay strong. This isn't over." Lisa broke free from Keisha's arms then, darting forward past the wooden barrier. "Daddy," she cried, reaching out her small hands. The bailiff stepped between them, but not before Thomas managed to brush his fingers against his daughter's. "Be good for your mama," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'll be home soon." No one in that courtroom believed those words, least of all Thomas himself. The week that followed moved in a blur of tears and desperate phone calls. Diane sold her wedding ring to pay for one last meeting with a better lawyer, a man named Howard Taylor, who reviewed the case file with growing disbelief. "This conviction shouldn't stand," Taylor told Diane across his cluttered desk. "The evidence is circumstantial at best, multiple alibi witnesses, no physical evidence connecting Thomas to the scene." He removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "But appealing will take time and money, more than I think you have right now. Our best hope is for Judge Brennan to show leniency at sentencing." Hope, such a small word to hang a family's future on. The sentencing hearing arrived on a rainy Tuesday. Water dripped from Diane's coat as she took her seat in the now familiar courtroom. She'd left the children with her sister. They'd said their goodbyes to their father the night before in a heartbreaking visit to the county jail. Thomas looked smaller somehow as he entered the courtroom, his shoulders hunched beneath the orange jumpsuit. A week in jail had left shadows under his eyes and new lines around his mouth. When he turned to look at Diane, she forced herself to smile, to be the strength he needed. Paul Griffin made a brief statement asking for minimum sentencing, citing Thomas's clean record and family responsibilities. The prosecutor countered with demands for justice for the community and a message to would-be criminals. Then it was Thomas's turn to speak. "Your Honor," he began, his deep voice steady despite everything. "I stand before you an innocent man. I didn't rob that store. I was fixing Mrs. Parker's car, just like I said, just like she testified." He paused, swallowing hard. "I've got 3 kids who need their father, a wife who needs her husband, a business that folks in our neighborhood count on. I'm asking you to look at me, really look at me, and see a man who's worked honest and hard every day of his life." Judge Brennan's face remained impassive throughout Thomas's plea. When Thomas finished, the judge shuffled some papers, not meeting his eyes. "Mr. Wilson, this court has found you guilty of armed robbery," Brennan began, his tone suggesting boredom rather than the gravity of the moment. "This is a serious crime that threatens the very fabric of our society. While you continue to deny your guilt, the evidence and the jury's verdict speak for themselves." He peered over his glasses at Thomas. "I see no remorse here, no acceptance of responsibility. Instead, I see a defendant who believes he is above the law." In the gallery, Ray muttered something under his breath, earning a sharp look from the bailiff. "Given the violent nature of your crime and your refusal to acknowledge your actions, I sentence you to 15 years in state prison." 15 years. Lisa would be 20 when her father came home. Anthony would be a grown man. Keisha would graduate high school, go to college, perhaps even marry, all without her father by her side. Diane couldn't breathe. The room spun around her as whispers erupted in the gallery. 15 years was nearly double what most first-time offenders received for similar charges. Even Paul Griffin looked stunned, rising to his feet to stammer out an objection. "Your Honor, with respect, the standard sentence for a first offense is at my discretion," Judge Brennan cut him off. "And I've made my decision." He banged his gavel with finality. "Court is adjourned." As the bailiff moved to take Thomas away, he turned to look at Diane one last time. The despair in his eyes nearly broke her. But beneath it, she saw something else, a fierce determination that told her he wouldn't be broken by this injustice. "Fight this," he mouthed to her silently. "Don't give up." And as they led her husband away in chains for a crime he didn't commit, Diane made a promise to herself, to her children, and to Thomas. This wouldn't be the end of their story. Somehow, someday, she would bring him home and expose the hatred that had torn their family apart. 3 years passed like a slow, painful crawl. The Wilson family's small house, once filled with the sounds of Thomas's deep laugh and the clinking of his tools, now echoed with absence. The kitchen table where they gathered each night had an empty chair that no one dared to move. Diane stood at the sink washing dishes, staring out the window at Thomas's workshop. Weeds had started growing between the cracks in the concrete. She'd tried to keep the business going for a while, hiring one of Thomas's former customers who knew a little about cars, but it wasn't the same. People stopped coming. Last month, she'd finally sold most of the tools to help pay for Anthony's college application fees. "Mom." Keisha appeared in the doorway, now 15 and growing to look more like her father every day. "Bus leaves in 10 minutes. Visiting day. The third Sunday of the month, the day they made the 3-hour drive to Westridge State Correctional Facility." Diane dried her hands on a dishcloth and forced a smile. "Lisa." "Anthony." "Time to go," she called up the stairs. Lisa bounded down first, now 8 years old, and still somehow holding on to her sunny nature despite everything. Anthony followed more slowly, his face already set in the hard mask he wore on these visits. At 17 he'd grown taller than Thomas now, his shoulders broad, his voice deep. But there was an anger in him that scared Diane sometimes, a simmering rage at the injustice that had stolen his father and forced him to become the man of the house too soon. The bus ride was quiet. Lisa colored in a book she'd brought to show her dad. Keisha stared out the window, headphones on. Anthony read a thick book about law that he'd checked out from the library, the third one this month. The prison loomed ahead of them, gray concrete walls topped with razor wire. No matter how many times they made this trip, Diane never got used to the sight of it. Her stomach twisted as they filed through security, belts off, pockets emptied, body scanned, dignity stripped. The visiting room was crowded as usual, full of families trying to connect across bolted-down tables under the watchful eyes of guards. When Thomas was let in, Lisa spotted him first. "Daddy," she called out, waving frantically. Thomas's face lit up at the sight of them, but Diane noticed how much older he looked. Prison had etched new lines around his eyes, added silver to his temples. He'd lost weight again. But when he hugged each of them, brief embraces under the guard's watchful eye, his arms were still strong, still felt like home. "How's my family doing?" he asked as they settled at a table, his voice warm despite the coldness of the room. They took turns giving updates. Lisa's A in spelling, Keisha making the basketball team, Diane picking up extra shifts at the hospital where she now worked as a receptionist. Thomas listened to it all with hungry attention, asking questions, laughing at Lisa's jokes, nodding seriously at Keisha's concerns about her jump shot. When it was Anthony's turn, he leaned forward. "I've been researching similar cases, Dad. Cases where convictions were overturned because of judicial misconduct or racial bias." Thomas and Diane exchanged a glance. Anthony had become obsessed with his father's case, spending hours at the library researching legal precedents. "That's good, son, but I don't want this to take over your life," Thomas said gently. "You should be thinking about college, about your future." "This is about my future," Anthony replied, his voice rising. "About all our futures, about justice." A guard looked over sharply, and Thomas placed a calming hand on his son's arm. I know, but your education comes first. Promise me." Anthony nodded reluctantly. Later, when Lisa went to buy a soda from the vending machine with Keisha, he leaned in again. "There's something else, Dad. I found out Judge Brennan sentenced another black man to 12 years last month for a gas station holdup. The guy had no record, just like you. But this white guy who robbed a convenience store the same week? 3 years probation, no jail time. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. I'm not surprised, son. It's a pattern, Anthony insisted. If we could prove bias. Time's up, called a guard, cutting their conversation short. The drive home was always the hardest part. The emptiness of returning without Thomas, the knowledge of leaving him behind in that cold place. Lisa fell asleep against Diane's shoulder. Keisha stared silently at the darkening sky outside the bus window. At home, after the kids went to bed, Diane sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. The stack of bills beside her seemed to grow taller each month, the mortgage they were behind on, Anthony's college applications, the car repair they couldn't afford. But it wasn't just money they were missing. It was Thomas's wisdom when Keisha started dating, his patience when Lisa struggled with math homework, his steady presence when Anthony's anger flared. The phone rang, startling her. It was late for calls. "Mrs. Wilson," said an unfamiliar voice when she answered. "My name is Benjamin Howell. I'm an attorney with the Justice Project. Your son Anthony contacted us about your husband's case." Diane's heart skipped. The Justice Project was a non-profit that worked to overturn wrongful convictions. They only took cases with strong evidence of innocence or misconduct. "We've reviewed the trial transcripts," the voice continued. "And I have to say, there are serious red flags here. If you're willing, I'd like to meet with you and discuss the possibility of filing for post-conviction relief." For the first time in 3 years, Diane felt something flicker in her chest, a dangerous feeling she hardly dared to name. Hope. Benjamin Howell looked nothing like what Diane had expected. With his worn jeans, faded t-shirt, and hair pulled back in a small ponytail, he seemed more like a musician than a lawyer. But the stack of folders he placed on their kitchen table and the intensity in his eyes when he talked about Thomas's case left no doubt about his profession. 10 years with the Justice Project, he told them, accepting the coffee Diane offered. "Before that, I was a public defender. I've seen too many cases like your husband's." Anthony sat beside his mother, taking notes in a spiral notebook. At 18, he deferred his college acceptance to the state university, insisting on staying home to help with the case. Keisha and Lisa listened from the living room, pretending to watch TV while straining to hear every word. "The trial transcript alone raises serious questions," Benjamin explained, flipping through highlighted pages. Judge Brennan shut down legitimate defense witnesses, allowed questionable testimony from the prosecution, and gave a sentence way beyond the norm for a first offense. "We knew all that," Anthony said impatiently. "What can we actually do about it?" Benjamin smiled slightly at his directness. "We've been building a pattern of behavior. Judge Brennan has a history of harsher sentences for black defendants, sometimes 2 or 3 times longer than white defendants with similar charges and backgrounds." He pulled out a graph with stark differences between colored bars. "We've analyzed over 400 of his rulings from the past 15 years. The pattern is undeniable, but proving bias is still difficult in our legal system." "So there's nothing we can do?" Diane asked, her hope fading as quickly as it had appeared. "I didn't say that." Benjamin leaned forward. "There's something else. While reviewing similar robbery cases from that time period, we found 3 more convenience store robberies that happened after Thomas was arrested. Same method, same description of the perpetrator." Anthony's head snapped up. "You think the real robber kept going?" "It looks that way. And here's where it gets interesting." Benjamin pulled out a police report. "A man named Victor Lee was arrested 2 years ago for a string of armed robberies across 3 counties. He's currently serving time at Eastwood." Diane's hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup. "And you think he's the one who really robbed the Quick Mart?" "The MO matches, the physical description fits, and most importantly, we found something the original investigation missed." He slid across a grainy photo. "This is from a security camera at the gas station across from the Quick Mart. It caught the getaway car, partial plate number, and a distinctive dent in the rear fender. We checked DMV records. Victor Lee owned a car matching that description at the time of the robbery your husband was convicted for." For a moment, no one spoke. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked. "What happens now?" Diane finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We petition for a review based on new evidence. We request DNA testing on evidence from the original crime scene. And Benjamin hesitated. We try to get Victor Lee to talk. Why would he confess to another crime? Anthony asked skeptically. He's already in prison. Because we can offer to help with his parole hearing coming up. Because sometimes people want to clear their conscience. Or, Benjamin shrugged, because I can be very persuasive when it comes to getting the truth. Over the next weeks, their house transformed into a makeshift legal office. The kitchen table disappeared under stacks of papers. Benjamin brought in 2 paralegals from the Justice Project. Anthony worked alongside them every day, learning legal terms, filing paperwork, making calls. Diane took on extra shifts at the hospital to cover the bills, returning home to find the team still working late into the night. Keisha stepped up to care for Lisa, cooking dinners and helping with homework. The empty chair at the table now held boxes of evidence instead, a different kind of absence, but one that felt like movement rather than stagnation. The day Benjamin went to interview Victor Lee at Eastwood Prison, Diane couldn't focus at work. She dropped a stack of files, forgot to transfer calls, and nearly gave a patient the wrong appointment card. By the time she got home, her nerves were frayed to breaking. She found Benjamin sitting at their kitchen table, his usually energetic face drawn with exhaustion. What happened? She asked, not sure if she wanted to hear the answer. He talked. Benjamin said simply, then broke into a tired smile. Victor Lee confessed to the Quick Mart robbery. Said he was surprised anyone was convicted for it, since he hit 5 other stores the same way. We recorded the whole interview. Diane's legs gave out, and she sank into a chair. So that's it. Thomas can come home now. Benjamin's smile faded. It's not that simple, Diane. A confession helps, but the courts move slowly. Judge Brennan will fight this. His reputation is on the line. We need more. What more could they possibly need? Anthony demanded, slamming his hand on the table. The real criminal confessed. We need to show that Thomas's conviction wasn't just a mistake, it was the result of bias. And for that, Benjamin pulled out a cassette tape from his briefcase. We needed this. He pressed play on a small recorder. A scratchy voice filled the kitchen. Older, male, slightly slurred, as if the speaker had been drinking. These people come into my courtroom thinking they deserve special treatment, the voice said. I've seen their type my whole life. Animals, most of them. Someone needs to keep them in line, and if that's me, so be it. Diane's hand flew to her mouth. Is that? Benjamin nodded grimly. Judge Walter Brennan, at his country club 2 nights ago, talking to what he thought was a sympathetic ear. Our investigator has been working on this for months. He stopped the tape. There's worse on here, much worse, racial slurs. Explicit admissions of bias. Enough to not only overturn Thomas's conviction, but potentially review every case Brennan ever presided over. For the first time in 10 years, Diane felt the full weight of possibility. Not just hope, but justice, real justice. Can I tell Thomas? She asked, tears streaming down her face, on our next visit. Benjamin nodded, clasping her hand across the table. Tell him to hang on. We're bringing him home. The courthouse looked exactly the same as it had 12 years ago, but Diane felt different walking up those stone steps this time. Behind her came Anthony, now a law student with serious eyes beyond his 23 years. Keisha, tall and graceful at 20, a hand holding Lisa's, who at 14 barely remembered a time when their father lived at home rather than behind prison walls. You ready for this? Benjamin asked, meeting them at the entrance. His ponytail was gone now, replaced by a neat haircut that matched his crisp suit, a concession to the formality of today's hearing. Diane nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. After 2 years of motions, delays, and legal battles, today was finally their day in court. The day Thomas might come home. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the case against Judge Brennan, who now faced a judicial conduct investigation and potential criminal charges himself. Reporters filled the back rows. Community activists who'd supported their fight held signs outside. Thomas's old customers, neighbors, and friends had come to witness what they hoped would be justice at last. All rise, called the bailiff. The Honorable Judge Patricia Hernandez presiding. The new judge was everything Brennan wasn't, careful, thoughtful, and fair. She'd been assigned after all of Brennan's cases came under review. For months, she pored over the evidence Benjamin and his team had assembled. Victor Lee's confession, the security footage that police had overlooked, testimony from a forensic expert about the unreliability of the original eyewitness identification, and most stunning, the recordings of Brennan's racist rants. When Thomas was led in by a guard, Diane's heart nearly stopped. He'd aged so much, his once black hair now mostly gray, his strong frame thinner, his face lined with the years stolen from him. But when he saw his family, the smile that broke across his face was pure Thomas, the same smile that had made her fall in love with him 25 years ago. The hearing moved quickly. The state's new prosecutor, a young woman with a pronounced sense of justice, didn't fight the motion to vacate Thomas's conviction. Your Honor, in light of the overwhelming evidence of both actual innocence and judicial misconduct, the state no longer has confidence in the conviction of Thomas Wilson. We move to dismiss all charges with prejudice and offer our sincere apologies for the miscarriage of justice that has kept an innocent man imprisoned for 12 years. Judge Hernandez looked at Thomas directly. Mr. Wilson, while no judicial order can restore the years taken from you, I can at least correct the record. Your conviction is vacated, all charges are dismissed, and you are hereby ordered released immediately. She paused, then added with genuine emotion, the court sincerely apologizes for the grave injustice you have suffered. The bang of her gavel was drowned out by cheers and sobs from the gallery. Lisa broke away, running toward her father as the bailiff stepped aside, no longer needing to guard a free man. Thomas opened his arms, catching his youngest child, who had grown from a small girl to a teenager during his absence. The family surrounded him, hugging and crying as reporters' cameras flashed. Diane couldn't stop touching his face, his hands, his shoulders, reassuring herself that he was real, that he was here, that he was finally coming home. Outside on the courthouse steps, they faced a crowd of reporters shouting questions. Benjamin fielded most of them, explaining the case and the broader investigation into Judge Brennan's history of biased rulings. But when someone asked Thomas how it felt to be free, he stepped forward. "Freedom tastes sweeter than I remembered," he said, his deep voice steady despite his emotion. "But this day isn't just about me. It's about every person sitting in a cell because the color of their skin made someone decide they were guilty before they ever walked into a courtroom. It's about judges like Brennan who abuse their power and hide behind their robes while they destroy lives." He looked at his family, at Anthony who'd sacrificed years to fight for him, at Keisha who'd grown up without her father's guidance, at Lisa who barely knew him outside of prison visiting rooms, and at Diane who had never stopped believing. "I missed my son's high school graduation. I missed my daughter's first basketball championship. I missed 12 years of bedtime stories with my youngest. I missed celebrating anniversaries with my wife. No apology, no settlement, no punishment for Judge Brennan can give those moments back to us." The cameras captured every word as Thomas continued. "But I'm not bitter. I'm determined. Determined to make sure this doesn't happen to other families. Determined to rebuild what was taken from us. And determined to hold accountable a system that lets people like Judge Brennan decide the fate of people they don't even see as fully human." That evening, Thomas Wilson walked through the front door of his home for the first time in 12 years. His old chair at the kitchen table waited, empty no more. The tools in his workshop had been replaced by Anthony and Ray in preparation for his return. And in the backyard, a family gathering welcomed him home with food, music, and the love that had sustained them all through the darkest times. As night fell, Thomas sat on the porch swing with Diane, their fingers intertwined. The weight of everything, the injustice, the lost years, the pain, still hung in the air between them. But there was something else too. A future, a second chance. "What happens now?" Diane asked softly, resting her head on his shoulder. Thomas looked out at their yard, where their children laughed with cousins and friends. "Now," he said, "we live." Freedom turned out to be both sweeter and harder than Thomas had imagined during those long prison years. The world had changed in ways both large and small. Cell phones were everywhere. His favorite corner store was now a coffee shop. Children he'd known as toddlers were driving cars. Some days, he'd find himself standing in a grocery store aisle, overwhelmed by too many choices after years of having none. "It's normal," Dr. Rivera told him during their weekly sessions. The state had provided counseling as part of the settlement package, one of many efforts to make amends for 12 stolen years. Your brain is relearning how to process freedom. Give yourself time. Time. Thomas had both too much and too little of it. Too much in the empty hours when the family was at work or school, when the silence of the house pressed in on him. Too little when he thought about how rapidly his children had grown up without him, how many moments he could never recapture. 3 months after his release, Thomas started working again. Not as a mechanic. His hands weren't as steady as they once were, a side effect of untreated high blood pressure during his imprisonment. Instead, he joined Benjamin at the Justice Project, speaking to law students about wrongful convictions and helping recently released men adjust to life outside. "You're a natural at this," Benjamin told him after Thomas calmed down a young man who'd spent 8 years in prison for a robbery his brother had committed. "You understand what they're going through in a way I never can." Thomas shrugged, just trying to make some good come from all this. The civil lawsuit against the county, the state, and former Judge Brennan dragged on for nearly 2 years. The recorded evidence of Brennan's racism had made headlines nationwide, forcing a review of every case he'd ever presided over. 37 convictions had been overturned so far, with dozens more under review. The once respected judge now faced his own legal troubles, disbarment proceedings, and criminal charges for obstruction of justice. "They're offering a settlement," Benjamin announced one evening, sitting at the Wilson family table. The whole family attended these meetings now. It affected all of them, and Thomas insisted everyone have a voice in the decisions. $3 million. No admission of liability beyond what they've already conceded, but no gag order either. You'd be free to continue speaking about your experience. $3 million, Diane repeated softly. The number seemed simultaneously enormous and inadequate. How did you put a price tag on 12 years? On missed birthdays and graduations? On the health problems Thomas now faced from inadequate prison medical care? "What do you think?" Thomas asked, looking around at his family. Anthony, now in his final year of law school, frowned. "We could push for more. Similar cases have gotten 5, even 7 million. But those took years," Keisha pointed out. She was studying nursing now, inspired by the healthcare workers who'd finally diagnosed Thomas's heart condition after his release. More time in courtrooms, more stress. Lisa, 17, and as direct as ever, looked at her father. "What do you want, Dad? It's your life they took." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. The ticking of the kitchen clock reminded him of prison, time passing, measured in small mechanical sounds. "I want to be done," he finally said. "I want to focus on living, not on fighting, and I want to use some of that money to help others like me." The Thomas Wilson Foundation launched 6 months later, dedicated to providing legal assistance to prisoners with credible claims of innocence, particularly in cases involving racial bias. The settlement money funded its first 5 years of operation, with donations and grants sustaining it afterward. Anthony joined as legal director after passing the bar, working alongside his father. But the stress and inadequate medical care during his imprisonment had taken a permanent toll on Thomas's health. The heart problems that began in prison worsened steadily. 5 years after his release, during a routine checkup, his doctor delivered difficult news. "Your heart is failing, Thomas," Dr. Patterson said gently. "We can manage it with medication for now, but you'll eventually need a transplant." Diane gripped his hand as they absorbed the news. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Without a transplant? Maybe 2 years, possibly less," they told the children that evening. Anthony punched a wall, his old anger flaring up anew. Keisha went into nurse mode, asking about treatment options and specialists. Lisa simply wrapped her arms around her father and held on tight. "It's not fair," she whispered. "We just got you back." Thomas held his youngest daughter, feeling her tears soak through his shirt. "Life rarely is, baby girl," he said softly, "but we've still got time." He made the most of that time. Despite his weakening heart, Thomas testified before state legislators pushing for judicial reform. He spoke at law schools across the country. He walked Keisha down the aisle at her wedding. He taught Lisa to drive. He sat proudly in the audience when Anthony argued his first case. Another wrongful conviction, another black man facing an unjust system. 18 months after his diagnosis, Thomas Wilson passed away in his sleep. The heart that had stayed strong through 12 years of wrongful imprisonment, that had expanded to forgive the unforgivable, that had loved his family through concrete walls and barbed wire, finally gave out. The funeral was attended by hundreds, family and friends, yes, but also men he'd helped free, lawyers he'd inspired, legislators whose votes he'd changed, students whose career paths had shifted after hearing him speak. Judge Brennan, awaiting his own trial, was nowhere to be seen. Anthony delivered the eulogy, his voice steady even as tears streamed down his face. "My father lost 12 years to injustice," he told the crowded church. But he gained something too, a purpose. In prison, he promised himself that if he ever got out, he would help others who'd been wronged like him. He kept that promise. Because of him, 17 men have been freed. Because of him, our state now requires recording of all judicial proceedings and transparent sentencing guidelines. Because of him, racism in our courts is being recognized and fought, not just whispered about. He paused, looking down at the casket draped with flowers. The system took my father from us twice, first through injustice, then through the physical toll of that injustice. But they couldn't take his dignity. They couldn't take his love, and they couldn't stop the change he started. 1 year later, Anthony stood on the steps of the newly renamed Thomas Wilson Judicial Center, watching as the sign was unveiled. Beside him, Diane smiled through her tears. Keisha held her newborn son, Thomas Jr., while Lisa, now in her first year of law school, recorded the moment on her phone. The judge who had sentenced Thomas out of hatred was serving his own prison term now. The system that had failed the Wilson family was slowly, painfully changing, and though Thomas hadn't lived to see this day, his legacy surrounded them, in the building that bore his name, in the lives he helped save, and in his children who carried forward his fight for justice. "He would have loved this," Diane said softly, squeezing Anthony's hand. Anthony nodded, watching as people filed into the judicial center that now stood as a symbol of accountability rather than oppression. "He's seeing it," he replied. Unsure of it. And somewhere, beyond the reach of earthly injustice, Thomas Wilson was finally truly free.